We have a tradition developed frequently in Sfar Makdoshim of Gedolei Chassidus that the different months of the year correspond to the Shvatim, the tribes. It goes back earlier, the Sefer Yetzirah. The source is a Meseres from Chazal. David HaMelech, Bnei Yisoscha points out, David HaMelech says in Tilim, Lifnei Ephraim u'Binyamin u'Menashe, Ororo es Gvurasecha. David HaMelech is asking, arouse, awaken your strength through, before, in front of these three Shvatim. Ephraim, Menashe, and Binyamin. Ulecho liyeshuosa lonu. And move the salvation sooner. The obvious question is what's unique about these three Shvatim, these three tribes of Ephraim, Menashe, and Binyamin. The first thing that comes to mind is they're all the progeny of Rachel. And we do have psukim that we're told, particularly about Yosef, but the children of Rachel will be somehow empowered for the ultimate confrontation with Esav. Bnei Yisoscha makes a very, very fascinating cheshvan that the Mishkan in the desert, that tabernacle, was completed in Kislev, the month of Kislev, but Moshe Rabbeinu postponed the assembling Alpian instructions, divine instruction, till Nisan, the month of Nisan, because that's the month that Yitzchak was born. And there's a special schus and connection that Nisan is a month of salvation and Yitzchak's Mesiras Nefesh. But so somehow Kislev, the month of Kislev, was left deficient. There was something missing. It ideally should have had that bringing and building of the tabernacle, but it didn't. So something is left, a debit is left for the month of Kislev. History would unfold that would be repaid in the time of the Chashmonaim, when the second bias, the real inauguration, because till that independence was gained, initially Bias Sheni was built through the largesse of the Persians, and there's a dimension missing. There's something missing. And there's only when the Chashmonaim, the real inauguration of Chanukah's Habayis Sheni, is related to, therefore, he says, the Bnei Yisoscha, as the month of Kislev. So Kislev got back, or will get back, depending on which point in history we're looking at it, its payment. Shlomo Melech builds the first Beis Mikdash. First Beis Mikdash, we're told that he actually was ready to go to make the inauguration in Cheshvan, Chodesh Bul, as it's referred to in Nach. But he postponed it to just short of a year later, to the month of Tishrei, Chodesh Etanim, the month that Avram was born. So now, Chodesh Cheshvan has a certain debit that's got to be repaid. It's as if there's a loan that was taken. The debit is Gilu de Rebbeinu Shalom, in his providential guidance, wants to pay back, as it were, Cheshvan. And we have Makeiros that the Bayis Shlishi ultimately will be in the month of Cheshvan. That'll be the month that Cheshvan will get back its due. He expands and says, he, meaning the Bnei Yisoscha, expands and says that the month of Kislev corresponds in this relationships that we have, the Meseres, to Shevet Binyamin. Cheshvan to Menashe, and Tishrei to Ephraim. So Ephraim, Tishrei worked. That was Shlomo Melech built it, first bias. Why would Kislev correspond to, I don't really know, but we do see some hints, some clues. The Chashmonaim were a rebellion against assimilation, Hellenization. Binyamin is the only one of the Shvotim that didn't bow down to Esav. He wasn't there. Binyamin, therefore, there's a retzua, there's a strip of land that goes out in the territory of Yehuda that is dedicated to the Mizbeach. And the Mizbeach will be in Binyamin's Chelek, that strip of land. Within Yehuda, but the Mizbeach was there, Binyamin. That makes somehow this place in time suited for place in space and a place in time suited for a certain special relationship. Perhaps, these bonim of Rochel, it's hard not to correlate it with the fact that Yosef stood in front of Rochel to hide her so that the eyes of Rosha, Esav, shouldn't see her. Kedusha, Tznius, Tyra, it's a monopoly of Oivdei Teira, B'nai Teira, Oiskim B'Teira of Am Yisrael. This month continues the B'nai Yisoscha, month with the Mabel intensified, was also the month of the split between Yehuda and Yisrael. Yerovam went into business for himself and said, don't need the Beis Mikdash, Chedesh Hashmini, we have alternatives, we have other options. A core root breach in the Achdus of Am Yisrael happened in Cheshvan. And therefore the ultimate tikkun will happen in Cheshvan. the ultimate tikkun, the Beis Mikdash HaShlishi. Posik says, Asher yachtov namtik so, together we will sweeten the secret, those levels of Torah, of understanding the Hashgacha that are vague to us today. It's b'chinas bilbul, confusion, bull. Where bebeis Elokim nahalech berogesh, to the Beis Mikdash will go with feeling, with sensitivity. And he said over b'shem Reb Shmuel Abuhav, berogesh is an acronym for Borod, Ruach, Geshem, Sheleg. Will resist an unpleasant environment, a challenge to go together. Yachtov. We need a Yachtov to be Namtik Sod. B'nai Yisoscha, coming back to the B'nai Yisoscha, also darshans the posik in Tilim, Yud Zayin, Tomoch Ashurai b'maglosecha, support my feet at the foot of be it the hills or the Avodah or the Beis Mikdash. Banamotu, my steps shouldn't slip, stumble. Tomoch, to support, suggests the B'nai Yisoscha is Oisius Tishrei Mar Cheshvan Kislev. Those months, Tomoch. Whatever happens, we don't have Nevi'im today. It says in Svarim, Sefer Chaim, the brother of the Maral, writes that there's a correspondence between when Anshe Knesset HaGedela were mevatel the Yetzer Hara, they cancel out, nullified the urge for idolatry. That's when we lost Nevuah. Because there has to be a correspondence. The Rebbeinu Shalom plays fair. And then we enter into a tkufa through Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebal Peh, through our learning, our purification that comes through learning, we attain to another step closer towards moving towards the climax of history of that Cheshvan when we'll see Bias HaGoel. This week's Parsha, you have Noach coming out of the Teva. Comes out, plants a vineyard, makes wine, gets drunk. Few approaches as to exactly how he was defiled and humiliated. But he was, one way or another. By Chom. Shem and Yefet undertake to correct the situation. And the Pasuk says, Vayikach Shem v'Yefet. It's a similar. Vayasimu, and they placed it on their shoulders, and they walked backwards, and they didn't look, and they covered him. There are 5 verbs in the sentence. Vayikach, Vayasimu, Vayelchu, Vayachasu, and Ro. All are in the plural except the first. Vayikach is in the singular. Rashi says because Shem was misametz b'mitzvah tchila, put more effort into the mitzvah, initiated. He took the initiative. And Yefet only joined him as a second thought. When the Bechai brings it, it's a Gemetush. The Netziv explains and draws a relationship to the rewards that each got. Netziv says, Shem proceeds from an hypothesis that a mitzvah is an essential good. It nourishes me and provides more spiritual resource and positive reality in the world at large. It starts with me and expands and extends to the world. I create an energy in the environment. Yefet has a different worldview. Yefet looks at the aesthetic. Life is a game. There is no essential good and evil. It isn't absolute. But man has a need. Why? Who knows? But he has a need to create self-dignity. That's part of the cargo he carries with him. So he has to invent it. And he creates games. And he creates cultures. And he creates an aesthetic system that gives him a sense and a feel of dignity. That he's a bit more than the animal and it's self-fulfilling. So Yefet stands on the side and he says, this is unpleasant situation. See one's father like that, Noach. But if Shem can do it, Bakasha, let him do it alone. Along the way, since it's a tricky business, the acrobatics of going backwards to not look and come, oh, he needs me? He jumps in and he helps. Remember, Shem's point of departure was there's a reality of a mitzvah. It's a metzias in the bria. Certain foods provide nutrients and certain don't. There's junk food. And there are foods that give vitamins. Mitzvahs provide nutrients. That's Shem's point of departure. So I want to do it. But it's also good. If it's good for me, that means it's good for the world in Ruchnius. And that's a microcosm of Klal Yisrael throughout the Deiros, that perfecting ourselves, starting with me, my learning, my davening, with my family, my community, my yedidim, and concentric circles of spiritual energy extend and include Klal Yisrael, in Eretz Yisrael, and then the world. And the world is not going to get what it needs until we make our tikkun and we put our house in order. Secular papers took note these days of how Nebuch Lo Aleinu, the Levias in the Haredi community, focus primarily on us correcting what we have to correct. State Department of America let out a statement that too much force is being used to quell the murders in the streets. Total denial, sheker. Briskerov once asked, white usually symbolizes truth. lack of any coloration. That's the basic reality. So how could Lavan's name be Lavan? It was the personification of dishonesty. Said the Riskarov Lamahadova Daima, it's to be compared to, during the communist regime, Yamach Shimon, prime newspaper was Pravda, which meant truth. So they had to give that name to the newspaper because had they given any other name, there might have been some feature of the newspaper that might have been true. So they had to call it truth. So Lovan is Lovan. When I see abbreviation of State Department, SD, to me it rings Sanitation Department. Truth is filtered, manipulated, ground down, and sanitized to fit the agenda. There are times in history where there might be some level of cooperation between Shem and Yefet. Sometimes the aesthetic does assist the true, but not necessarily. Last week's parsha we read that Rashi anticipates that the nations of the world are not going to make peace with us being here. And we're going to have our rebuttal to their sanitizing of the truth. It's not going to help too much with them, but we need it for ourselves. They have their conclusions before they start. We talked on Hoshana Rabbah about the Groz, famous pshat and the Tilim, Vahi b'Shalem Sukkom and Ose b'Tzion, 2 mitzvahs you enter in with your entire body, Sukkah and Eretz Yisrael. And we try to understand it, that how come Lo Sed Lovai? Eventually that'll be the mitzvah that the Rebbeinu Shalom is the litmus test between the Goy and the Jew. They're given Sukkah, they fail. Why Sukkah? There are other mitzvahs, Kalas. And we understood it to say that this comprehensiveness, that's why we need Eretz Yisrael. The totality of human existence is raw material available. Everything can be shaped for Kvod Shemayim. Even that which is a Dova Shebereshus. Not necessarily obligated to do at this moment, but I can utilize the raw material of any resource to bring it to mitzvah. And we said that like a program where people tolerate the commercial to get back to the program, the Gentile mentality is they can tolerate a certain amount of spirituality to get back to the program of life. And the Jew says, no, it's all. It's all an opportunity and therefore some level of responsibility to utilize for Kvod Shemayim, not just the commercial. And that's Sukkah, and that's Eretz Yisrael, and that's why we need our own land, and that's why it's intolerable, as the Sfas Emes says, Pollock sends in his missive to Bilam, Am Yotzei Mitzrayim b'chisa sein ha'oretz, they're covering the land Says the Sfas Emes, what he meant to say, they changed our attitude towards the material world. We can no longer take it for what it is. They're saying it's a resource to be used for spirituality, to squeeze the sparks of Kedusha and to connect through that. It's intolerable. And so on, there's a root. That's why when the Goyim sent a korban to the Beis Mikdash, there's always a korban oila. Shlomim is a Jewish concept. Odin ala oretz, says Avraham Avinu. Use outzius. Use the physical universe. That's our only way of accessing. The Rebbe Shem created us as this merging of the physical and the spiritual. Parshas Lech Lecha, before Avraham Avinu is given that level of commitment to Eretz Yisrael, Bris Milah, to change him, the Gavra has to change so that he can access the potential of this spiritually unique place. And this spiritual chemistry between the Jew and the land can then be developed. During the first Gulf War, Rav Shach, staff asked Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zichrono Levacha, Zichr Tzadik Levacha, each. Fellows were under pressure. Come home. Should people that are not here yet, on their way here, come? Rav Shach and Rav Shlomo Zalman, independently of each other, both said the same thing. You're with a tzibur. To separate from that tzibur creates a certain weakness and hurts the tzibur. Your priority obligation is to stay with the tzibur. I had heard that Rav Steinemann should be gesund, had answered people asking, inquiring from Chutz La'aretz, should they come or shouldn't they come? And he said they should come. They're coming to learn, they should come. They're coming as a tourist, it's a different question. But I sent in a shliach yesterday to Rav Steinman. He said, Torah protects and saves the individual and the tzibur. Rav Steinman stood here, sat here, twice in this Beis Medrash in the last years, giving sichot, talks, in this Beis Medrash. And he talked about Hakos HaTov, about the sense of Hashgocha in history. And I repeat that I heard it myself from Chaim Shmulevitz, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, how indebted we have to be to those soldiers, policemen that are on first step contact. Chaim said, anybody that doesn't have a Hakos HaTov to them is a Kofui Tov. Kofui Tov limits his own access to the Tov. But that has nothing to do with the critique that we know to be namtik sod, to put it all together, to try and understand. It's not going to all fall into place We're only going to have bits and pieces, hopefully more, hopefully more. Some of you have heard me use the term, there's a certain interaction and balance business people have with expecting cash and giving credit. The more somebody's paid cash, the more you give them credit. In our mercantile metaphysic, the Rebbeinu Shalom has paid enough cash in history that when we have to extend credit, I don't know why this happened to that person. And I'm not expected to know. And it's unreasonable to think that I should know. But I do know that if Chazal say that the Torah protects and guards, that's a metzias, it's an actuality. There comes a point through one's own learning that we transcend even the limitations that anchor us to earthliness. Rav Shach said something stunning in those years. He said, if somebody says he's paralyzed, can't function, what can you do? His mother, sick in bed. Every mother is concerned. It's the definition of being a mother. But if she gets so sick that I don't pretend to know how to quantify such a thing. But that level of concern, and that level of concern that we all have, Hishtadlus, of course. We do that which reasonable, makes sense. That's a responsibility. I do that for Panosa too. But the reality of knowing that what we assumed, where most of us have come from culturally, nationally, that there was a certain commitment to morality, a commitment to truth. The lies in the newspapers and the media have just blown it wide open. It's not even close anymore. Major newspapers, major governments buying in because of their agendas. But I have to keep my perspective, I have to keep my sanity, which is to know what is the truth. I think in past wars that I've lived through here, others testify to, that secular Israeli soldiers have behaved on a level that no army in history ever behaved like that. I think it's in their blood. It's not just sensitivity to world opinion. Of course, today it's compounded by that as well. But they're Yidden. Rachmonim b'nei Rachmonim. Rav Shach said then, if somebody does leave, he shouldn't live with the illusion that he won't be missing an aliyah, a certain elevation of the tzibur that you can't get any other way except when the tzibur is under stress. He'll forfeit that. Should he go? Shouldn't he go? Well, he has to quantify whether he's paralyzed or somebody at home is sick because he's here sick. Perhaps has a quantification like for Shabbos Nofel Lemishkov. Concerned? Frightened? Of course. Pachad Yitzchak. We're malumed in being frightened. But being frightened doesn't mean you don't have courage. Somebody who has courage without being frightened is not courage. It's foolishness. But you rise above it. This is a month that Polonius, the Mabul, there are those, Bnei Yissaschar quotes that say, extraordinary percentage of Gzeiros, decrees against Klal Yisrael throughout the generations happened in the month of Cheshvan. It was the split between Yisrael and Yehuda. And if the Beis Mikdash is ultimately to happen now, in this month, Menashe, it's interesting, Menashe, when Yaakov gives the brachas, he has Ephraim and Menashe lined up in front of him to his grandchildren. Brought up in Mitzrayim, an alien culture, doesn't recognize them initially. And he gives precedence to Menashe was actually over here. I'm sorry, Ephraim was over here. Skips over Menashe. The obvious question is, why doesn't he just switch the places? Some people say that it just might have been more embarrassing for Menashe. I'm not sure. I understood it in a different way. I understood that he was indicating that it's only an interim arrangement. It's temporary. So Menashe is going to come back to Menashe. Perhaps that's what's alluded to in, I think the Bnei Yissaschar says something similar in one place. It is a time for us to, there's such a thing as wartime. Wartime, civilians have to perform differently as well. Now the war is it's in the streets. That's the reality. But we can generate here, in this room, every other Beis Mikdash, an arsenal of spirituality, ruchniistic ammunition that are going to help those who are physically meisa nefesh to protect us here as well. But right now it's all over. There's no front and there's no home. The streets are the front. Have we seen, can people testify to the fact, it's a fact, that B'nai Torah Talmidei Chachamim, Nebuch Lo Aleinu, have also been killed, wounded? Teire Matzle Magna? The answer is, I don't know the individual Cheshvan. Nobody knows. And Rav Steinemann also says he doesn't know. And Rameya Simcha said it, the Steipler quotes him, and others have said it, the Chazon Ish said, every bullet has its address. That person might have died some other way. We don't know the Rebbeinu Sham's Cheshbainis. But as far as doing what we have to do as Yechidim, and reinforcing the tzibur, and strengthening the tzibur, it's our davening, our learning, that are going to do it. Somebody asked me that we talk frequently about the responsibility to be b'simcha. How are you b'simcha in such times? I think there is a kind of simcha that can be simultaneous with the fear. Gilu b'roda. That's the challenge. What's the simcha? The simcha is rooted in that I have been given the tools to do what I have to do. I have the resources and the tools to do what I have to do. And Klal Yisrael, collectively, can make that difference. Bnei Shalom should be mezaka us, Klal Yisrael, Ruach Mimal. We should see Shalom, Refuas, the Yeshuas, to those wounded, the Chomas, to those families that have suffered losses, and should give us the koyach to do our part in this conflict with integrity, with sincerity, and b'simcha.